All right, so we're diving deep today into mythology. We usually picture like Greek gods and monsters when we hear mythology, right? But it's going to be way more than that.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Mythology, it's like this huge collection of stories, beliefs, legends, all those things kind of woven together to tell us about a culture, you know? I mean, imagine trying to figure out like a crazy thunderstorm or an earthquake without any scientific knowledge. You'd probably come up with some pretty powerful gods, too, to explain that stuff.
Totally. And it's not just like the natural world, right? Myths get into all those big human experiences too, like love and loss, betrayal, courage, all of that. And these stories have stuck around for centuries, helping us try to make sense of those big questions.
For sure. And I think it's really interesting how, even today, with all our science and technology, we're still drawn to these ancient stories. You see them everywhere in books, movies, even the way we talk about technology sometimes.
Like, what if modern science is kind of like a mythology itself? It sounds crazy at first, but then they talked about how people like Einstein or Carl Schwann, they are almost revered like prophets, and it makes you wonder,
Yeah, I see what you mean. Science, it is based on evidence and observation, but it's still made by people. So, our interpretations, our biases, even our desire to understand the universe, it all plays a part.
and Einstein and Schwann are scientific deities because of how much respect they get. What do you think about that?
Well, there's some similarities. We definitely hold those brilliant minds in high regard, just like ancient cultures with their gods. But I think it's super important to remember that scientific authority, it's built on research, experiments, all that, not just blind faith.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's different from actually worshiping someone as a god. And also the different types of stories you find within mythology, like legends and folk tales. And I think some good examples too, like the Greek gods for myths, Alexander the Great for legends, and of course the boogeyman for folk tales. Can you break down those categories a little more for us?
Sure. So, myths usually have supernatural beings in them and often explore big questions about the origins of the world or the forces that control our lives, like those classic Greek myths about creation or the battles between gods and titans. Then you have legends. They usually feature humans, but their deeds and abilities are often exaggerated to make them larger than life. They often start with a little bit of historical truth, but the story changes and grows over time until it becomes a mix of fact and fiction. So, like Alexander the Great was a real person, but the stories about his conquests might have gotten a little wilder with each retelling. And then we have folk tales, which are more like fictional stories passed down through generations. They often carry moral lessons or warnings like the boogeyman hiding in the dark to scare kids into behaving. It is interesting, isn't it? When you really think about it, a lot of superhero stories have those same archetypal roles that you find in traditional mythology. Like Superman, he's almost like a modern-day sun god, right? He's got amazing powers, a strong moral code, and he's always saving people.
And I bet you're going to say Wonder Woman has connections to ancient myths too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Her whole origin story being sculpted from clay and brought to life by the gods that echoes creation myths from all over the world. And she represents strength, wisdom, and compassion. Qualities you see in goddesses throughout history.
Okay, I'm convinced. What about Batman, though? He may not be godlike, but he does have a unique mythic quality that draws people to his story.
Batman embodies some of the darker, more brooding aspects you see in a lot of underworld figures. He's constantly fighting for justice, battling his inner demons, and he's always associated with the night. It all taps into those primal archetypes that have fascinated people for centuries.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. It's amazing how these seemingly modern stories are actually drawing on those ancient patterns and themes. It's almost like we're surrounded by mythology and we don't even realize it. So, how have scholars tried to understand all this? What do you think of theories going all the way back to the 19th century?
Yeah, the study of mythology has definitely changed over time. Scholars have come up with all sorts of interpretations. In the 19th century, there was this guy named Max Miller. He thought myths came from misunderstandings of language. He argued that as language changed over time, the original meanings of words, especially the ones describing nature, got distorted, and that's how mythological figures were born.
So, you're saying that the language itself could be creating mythological thinking. That's a pretty wild idea.
Right? Another big thinker from the 19th century, Edward B. Tylor, he saw myth as a kind of primitive science, like it was humanity's first attempt to explain the world before they had scientific methods. He thought rituals were just practical ways to use those myths to try and control the natural world.
Yeah, like those stories that they aren't just entertainment. They're shaping how we see the world, our values, all that. They tell us right from wrong, hero versus villain, even how we should act in different situations. Like those superhero movies we were talking about before. Maybe they aren't just mindless entertainment, but a modern way of showing those ancient archetypes, like playing out our anxieties and hopes on the big screen.
Exactly. And speaking of modern storytelling, you can't forget Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. It's like the blueprint for every epic adventure out there. Star Wars, Harry Potter, everything.
I've actually tried using Campbell's framework in my own writing. It's pretty amazing how versatile it is. Can you remind us how that journey goes again?
Well, Campbell said, almost all hero stories follow the same basic structure. 3 acts: departure, initiation, and return. So, the hero, they leave their ordinary world, face all these challenges, and then ultimately come back, but they're changed by their experiences. And that's why it's so powerful, right? It mirrors our own lives, our own journeys of growth. Think about it. Have you ever faced a challenge, gone through a tough time, and then come out the other side feeling stronger or wiser? That's the hero's journey. It's happening all around us in our own lives and in the stories we tell.
That's a beautiful way to put it. That brings us to the American monomyth, which they talked about using Captain America as an example. Can you explain that one?
The American monomyth, it's this recurring narrative in American culture of about a hero operating outside the system to restore justice. This lone hero, they often use violence to achieve their goals, and they usually represent rugged individualism and a strong moral code. Captain America, he's always going against authority to do what he thinks is right. He's like a perfect example of that. He's the embodiment of the American monoth, fighting for freedom and justice, even if it means going against the grain.
But they also said that Captain America complex can be a problem, right? It can be. It's like a double-edged sword. The American motto myth can inspire courage, resistance, but it can also be used to justify violence, to undermine democracy even. We have to be aware of how this narrative works and really examine what it means. Makes you think if that monomyth still holds up today or if it's changing into something else.
That's a great question to think about. Our society changes. The myths we tell ourselves change, too. It's an ongoing process. This back and forth between our values and the stories that shape how we see the world.
So after all those theories, my head was spinning. There were so many different ways to look at mythology, but then there was also this guy, William G. Doty. He had a way of bringing it all together.
Oh, yeah. Doty's eightfold view of myth. It's a really helpful way to see how complex those stories really are. He said, myths aren't just doing one thing. They're aesthetic expressions, explanations of where we come from, reflections of our values. They can even be outlets for our deepest psychological needs, our spiritual needs even. So, it's not about finding the one right interpretation. It's more like realizing that myths work on all these different levels at the same time. And that brings us back to that main point. Even in our modern world with all our science and technology, we're still living in the shadow of myth.
It's so true. Think about how we talk about like scientific discoveries or new technology. We use this almost mythical language, like we're unlocking the secrets of the universe or pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. It's that same human need to find meaning, to make sense of the world. The same need that made our ancestors create those ancient myths. We may have better tools now to explore the universe, but that basic desire to find our place in it all, to understand why we're here, that hasn't changed at all. So, are we making new myths today without even knowing it?
That's the big question. Think about the stories we tell about technology, for example, artificial intelligence. We talk about it like it's almost a god with this incredible power for good or for evil.
Like in those sci-fi movies, where AI becomes self-aware and either saves us or destroys us.
Exactly. It's like we're projecting all our hopes and fears onto these technologies, creating modern myths about what they can do.
Wow, this deep dive has been honestly eye-opening. I feel like I see myths everywhere now.
I'm glad to hear that. It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
So, as we wrap up, what's the one thing you hope listeners will take away from all this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that myths are alive. They aren't just ancient stories or fairy tales. They're powerful forces that still shape how we see the world, our beliefs, our values, everything. So by understanding that, we can be better thinkers, more conscious about the culture we're creating, more engaged in the world.
This has been an amazing conversation. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into mythology.
My pleasure. Keep exploring. Keep questioning. Keep looking for those deeper layers of meaning in everything around you.
And next time you're watching a superhero movie or scrolling through social media or even reading the news, ask yourself what myths are at play here and how are they shaping how I see the world. Thanks for listening, and please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell.